we're going to pivot now to the next part of the afternoon and talk about a very different database called Pirate. We call it Pirates. You have to have names for all these databases, of course. So this is profiles of individuals who've radicalized in the United States, basically, Pirates. So the GTD that we talked about earlier was based on events. So if you end up using the database in the future, you should keep that in mind. So in other words, we know about groups or individuals in the GTD because of the event, right? If there's no event, the event is the trigger. This database, on the other hand, is based on individuals. It's based on individuals, and I'll explain how you get into the database in just a second in more detail. So it's a somewhat different database, but it's similar in the sense that it's also based on unclassified data. Given that it's on the United States, though, we were able to get much more use out of court records, which are full of lots of good information, as you all know. So there's a lot more court records than news media stuff in this one, but still the same general idea. It's all unclassified data. And I'll again have a couple of cards to pass out at the end if you're interested in getting more information about this database and another one that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to skip the start part and go straight away to where we're at. Now, I said earlier that I think it's a fair statement that we were slow to come to the party. Not just us, but the world has been slow to come to the party in terms of studying terrorism. And the day after 9/11, it's not an exaggeration to say that I think no one on the planet could tell you how much terrorism there was, whether it was going up or going down. And no one in the United States, I think, could tell you how many people had been convicted of terrorism-related charges or had been killed through some sort of an investigation. We weren't collecting that kind of data. And in fact, as you all know, there were some pretty strong reasons for not doing it. Like the State Department, for example, was not able to collect data on American citizens. Likewise, the CIA. So for a variety of reasons, some of them legal, some of them, I don't know, some of them, I guess, cultural. We didn't have a whole lot of data on terrorists in the United States. So when we saw this, our overall goal was to try to start collecting a robust set of data on terrorism in the United States at the individual level. Now, there were case studies, and there are quite a few case studies. A lot of people have written books about individuals or small groups of individuals. But even when they get into case studies, they often are limited in the sense that they only concentrate on the violent political extremists. So in other words, let's say you find out that 30% of violent political extremists have a history of mental health problems. Well, if you don't have a comparison group, you don't really know what that means. I mean, maybe Americans in general have a history of, 30% of us have histories of mental problems, right? I mean, there's no comparison group. So when we started thinking about this, we were interested in not just people who committed violent extremism, but also people who'd committed nonviolent extremism. So the idea is we would compare ideologues, people who were devoted to the cause, but some of whom had been pushed a little bit farther into actually committing violent acts. So let me explain a little bit about how this works. As I say, it's called Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States, and we're interested in trying to develop empirical data on this and trying to understand radical behaviors and radical beliefs. And in fact, I think when we first started hearing the word used a lot, radicalization, I think we had a sort of simplistic version of it. And I'd be interested in your comments because many of you are working in the field with individuals that are in similar circumstances. But I think the idea of radicalization first, at least the way the press was putting it out, it's kind of a lockstep, that something sort of moves you towards this radical belief, and then something else happens and you get a little bit more down this pyramid or up this pyramid, and eventually those radical beliefs lead to some radical action. But, when you talk to people who've been terrorists, it doesn't seem that simple. Like, I was talking with a gentleman at the break that studies gangs, and as he pointed out, it's very hard to talk to radical extremists in the United States because many have been killed or they're unwilling to talk to you. But we have had quite a few interviews with ex-terrorists like IRA and ETA. And talking to some of the IRA guys, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to ever do that, but they're pretty damn radical still. I mean, they still have radical beliefs, right? but they're not acting on it anymore for whatever reason. So in other words, this link between radical attitudes and radical beliefs is not a 100% link. An even more dramatic episode of this is we do quite a bit of polling in the United States, and we've done some in Europe and in the Middle East as well. And if you do a poll in the United States, I'm making this up a little bit, but I've got it basically right, something like 20%, I'd say, of Muslim Americans will say it's okay to use suicide bombing under the right circumstances. But obviously, a very, very tiny minority of Muslim Americans will ever do it. And that's typical. I think that comes out in Canada and Europe as well. So in other words, if you're just focusing on attitudes, you're going to waste a lot of energy on people that aren't going to do anything, right? That the link between attitudes and behavior. In fact, I know some of you have psychology backgrounds in here. You know that the linkage between attitudes and behaviors is actually pretty weak. So you end up with a lot of people with radical attitudes, but they don't engage for a whole variety of reasons. And sometimes I think you find the reverse. I am shocked sometimes reading these case studies of people who do not, they're not radical ideologues in terms of understanding the religion or having a sophisticated idea of the Quran, and yet they're willing to strap on a suicide vest and take their life. So in other words, you also get radical behavior sometimes without seemingly radical attitudes. I mean, we know that some people get into it because their brother was in it, or somebody they play soccer, or a boyfriend, or a girlfriend. So in other words, we started looking at this and thinking, this pathway to radicalization is a lot more complicated, and boy, we could sure use some really concrete data on it. And so that was the sort of background for Pyrrhus. And just because, in our book, we have a table that has the 10 deadliest terrorist attacks in American history. And, it feels a little bit like you've stepped onto an elevator in Manhattan and you're trying to draw some conclusions about the people on the elevator with you. I mean, look at this. I have just 3 recent ones. Dylan Roof, Omar Mateen, and Syed Rizwan Farouk and Tashfeen Malik. All high-profile, violent, serious attackers. Try to put those folks into a profile, though, right? I mean, such different cases. And if you look at, you throw in, if you're looking at this list of the top 10, you'd get into Oklahoma City. Let's throw that one in, another very unique case, and 9/11, certainly a very unique case. So, in other words, we didn't want to just go, like I was saying earlier, we were trying to develop an empirical, scientific approach to understand these sorts of very big differences. And I'm not going to have time to go into great detail on the database. I'm going to pass out some cards if you're interested in learning more about it. But today, what I thought I'd concentrate, because I know we have people in the field working with law enforcement directly for the most part, that I was going to sketch out for you our attempt to actually do a profile, to go through this data and say, well, what are the characteristics that are most likely to predict violent extremism? So that's going to be kind of my goal in this afternoon's talk. So this project is multi-method in the sense that we have a quantitative component. We have about almost 1,500 individuals. We code maybe 200 different characteristics. I'll get into those in just a second. But we also have a qualitative component. So we've done about 110 case studies. So these are much more detailed life histories of these people and what makes them tick. So we've used both of those for some of the work we're doing. As I say, this is coded entirely from unclassified sources. Court records are the best if you can get court records, but some of these have had actually extensive biographies done. We use also newspaper reports and declassified government resources. All this stuff has been coded by a team at the University of Maryland at the START Center. So the database itself includes information on the plot and consequences, so where it happened, date of exposure, whether it was violent or not, whether there were criminal charges, what those charges were. We get information of the groups the individuals were associated with, what their role in the group was. In fact, right now, as I was coming out here, we're actually working on this project where we're contrasting people who identify themselves as leaders and people who identify themselves as followers. And we haven't published this yet, but it's pretty fascinating because the leaders are much more sophisticated in terms of attitudes, in terms of understanding the ideology, but they're less likely to engage in violence. The followers do the violence, basically. So they're running the show, but they have other people do the dirty work, sort of. Anyway, we're working on that. We have information on group dynamics. And then we have a lot of information on how this radicalization process happens. You know, what ideology are they connected in? How did they get recruited? You know, was the recruitment online? Was it in person? Was it somebody they knew? How did they get recruited? We've been, you know, obviously like all of us, more and more interested in the internet and social media. I brought a couple of slides just to illustrate some of the ways we're doing that. We're also looking at, you know, basic social science demographics, who they are, gender, age, ethnicity, marital status, and so on. We've got data on socioeconomic status. We also have personal details, social life, drug, alcohol abuse, family relationships, and so on. So I think all in all, maybe 200 variables. And this is a living database because the threat environment continues to evolve. So we had this thing up and running, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and then foreign fighters became a huge issue. And we had no data on foreign fighters, so we went back through, added data on foreign fighters. We've gone back through and added data on gangs, and we're right now going through adding stuff on social media, which ends up becoming more and more important over time. So, how do you get into PIRIS? How do you get into this database, these 1,500 people? Well, you must have one of the following. You had to have been arrested, indicted, killed in action. A fair number of these folks have been killed in action. Or a member or an associate of a FTO, a designated terrorist organization, or a member of an association with an organization whose leader or founders have been indicted of an ideologically motivated violent offense. And we give some examples here. In addition, all of them have to have these 3 criteria. These are all folks who are radicalized in the United States principally. Some of them have done some foreign travel, but most of the action for them has taken place in the United States. All of them espouse, either in the past or currently, radical ideological motives, and all of them have shown through their behavior that they're linked to the motives that they're espousing, to the social movement they're espousing. So in terms of basic stats, as I say, they're about, we actually have a few more than this now, but around 1,500 individuals. Average age of exposure is interesting, 34, and the criminologists in the room will know that that's old. And in fact, one of the things that it looks like to us, and we've actually been doing some work comparing these guys to gang members, the gang members are younger. Interestingly, the gang members and the terrorists both have about the same amount of time in the organization. For both groups, it's about 6 years, but the gang members are much younger, which I think is important. You might remember a while ago the Paris attacks that happened a while ago. The police had thought about the guys that ended up doing it, but they sort of stopped looking at them because they thought they were too old to fit the profile. But it looks to me like the profile for terrorists is going to be somewhat older than ordinary offenders or gang members. Most are men, no surprise there. We do have about 152 women, mostly U.S. citizens. And we're able to divide them into 4 ideological categories. We've got Islamist, far right, far left, and single issue are kind of a grab bag. They're individuals that are organized around a specific ideological cause, like anti-abortion activists could be in this category, or it could be Puerto Rican separatists. So if we take a picture, a big picture of what's going on in the database to give you an idea of what's happened with ideology, this goes back to 1965. We have some cases as far back as the 1940s. But you'll see the gray area are people who are far left in the database, far leftists. Red are the far right, and the yellowish are the Islamists. So you can see most of the far left actions back in the 70s and a little bit in the 80s. Far right, pretty active in the 90s. And Islamist, of course, is pretty recent. Most of the action is happening pretty recently. So right now, most of the mix, if you look at the very recent cases, most of the mix is either far right or Islamist. And just a few leftist groups in there. And again, feel free to interrupt questions if you have any questions about any of this stuff. We can also look at things like whether they are group actors or lone actors. And the red lines show lone actors from 65 up to 2013. You can see that in recent years, we're getting almost close to 50% of the cases are lone actors, so-called lone wolves. This is, I'm sure all of you have been thinking about this. This is a bit tricky when you get into it. I mean, you can ask yourself whether it's possible in the internet age to have a lone actor. because it's not like these folks are not connected to the internet to other sorts of individuals. But nonetheless, they're people who are not part of an organized group, or they're not receiving material support from an organized group. And you can see that that number is increasing over time. So I'll just give this one example. I mentioned we've just been expanding the database to include information on foreign fighters. It turns out that of these 1,470 some people, 226 expressed an interest in going overseas to fight for a terrorist organization. 193 of them actually got there. 193 of them actually attempted to do it, took specific action to do it. 118 were successful, and 51 returned to the United States. And just to give you one example of the utility of collecting this data, one of the surprises we got is in terms of actual dangerousness, attacks, and fatalities, the group that wanted to go but didn't succeed was actually more dangerous than the group that went and came back, which is important to know. To be honest, I had totally missed that point when I was looking at this issue before. So I think we're going to want to take a broad approach to this foreign fighter issue. We also could look at things like radicalization on the internet. The red line here shows internet did not contribute to radicalization. The black line says that internet was a primary factor. You can see that basically starting in about 2007, you're getting almost 100% of the people in this database have at least, are saying that at least part of the radicalization process was online. And again, you have to figure out what to make of this, because your 90-year-old grandmother is probably also online most of the time. But it clearly is a new development that's growing in significance and importance. And in fact, if you look at, was it the primary factor in radicalization, which again is the red line, we're finding that by 2015, in about half the cases, people are saying it was the primary source of their radicalization, the primary way they were getting information, which again is a bit of a game changer. And when you think about this from a law enforcement standpoint, it's a huge nightmare, because you think about, the public says, well, why didn't you cover these people? Well, it's difficult enough to cover a bunch of suspects. I mean, you should look at the foreign fighter problem, for example. Not so much in the United States, but certainly in Europe, where there will be hundreds and even thousands of people returning. And how do you cover all those people? But with the internet, then how do you cover the friends of those people and the friends of the friends? And it's like network that's spread all over. I think it becomes essentially impossible pretty rapidly. Okay, so the start off for what I want to talk about, we were talking about a little bit at the end of the last presentation, which is this kind of uneasy fit. I think this gentleman actually raised the point. This uneasy fit between crime and terrorism. So I have two quotes here, one from Clark and Newman, who did this nice piece on situational prevention of terrorism. And they say terrorism is a form of crime in all essential respects. And I agree with that. It's obviously breaking the law. It's an illegal act, etc. But then this book, or this thing that I wrote with a colleague of mine, Laura Dugan, a while back. But we also know that political violence clearly differs in important respects from ordinary crime. Most ordinary criminals do not regard themselves as altruists. Most of them do not think that they're doing an act that's actually making the world a better place. But that's a pretty common thing for terrorists. Most ordinary criminals are motivated by obtaining something they want. Certainly comparing that to a suicide bomber is a pretty different thing. So I think we're in this kind of limbo where criminology has something to say about terrorism, but it probably is not going to be sufficient. We're probably going to have to go beyond sort of straight criminology theories. Nonetheless, it's a good place to start, and that's where I wanted to kind of start tonight by looking at, or this afternoon, by looking at some criminology theories. And so what I wanted to talk about is whether we can use PIRUS, this database, to identify a set of risk factors for violent political extremism. Can we look at the characteristics of these individuals and help predict which ones are going to actually turn to violent terrorism? And to do this, I'm going to return to some sort of common criminology perspectives. And I asked the room a while ago, how many of you have criminology backgrounds? And quite a few people raised their hand. I'm going to really dig down in the weeds to your criminology background, for those of you who have one, and refer to this theory called social control. Some of you may remember this from your criminology classes. It's the idea that individuals develop bonds that connect them to society, and that the stronger those bonds are, the less likely you are to engage in crime or deviance. So the theory sort of assumes that you're not necessarily a better person when you're 25 or 30, but you have more to lose. You have a wife, you have kids, you spent all this time getting a college degree. So you've got a lot more to lose than a typical 15-year-old, and therefore you're more likely not to break the law, basically. So it's a theory that says the strength of your bonds to society. So if you're married, if you've got a good job, if you've got an education, all of those sorts of things make it less likely for you to engage in illegal behavior or illegal violence. It also builds in the idea that there can be turning points. I was talking to this gentleman in the back who was dealing with gang members, and he was telling me that there are cases where gang members, and I'm sure you've run into this, where gang members turn things around. Some people think that a good marriage will do that, right? That a good woman will turn things around for you. Some people would argue a good job could help. It used to be common that people would say a military experience, right? That you're kind of getting all kinds of mischief, and then you did a stint in the military, and that sort of turned you around. So it could be there are turning points. But the idea is these social connections bind individuals to society, and they prevent violence. So we were interested in seeing, well, does that work when it comes to terrorists? So we came up with 4 hypotheses about that. 1, individuals with a poor work history will be more likely to turn to violent extremism. 2, as educational attainment increases, people with more education are less likely to turn to terrorism. People who are married will be less likely, or you can flip it the other way and say the unmarried, separated, or widowed are more likely to turn to violent extremism. Individuals who've had past military experience, less likely to turn to violent extremism. And individuals who are currently active members of the military, less likely to turn to violent extremism. Again, going back to your those of you with criminology backgrounds, there's this learning theory. Social or differential association is the most famous version of it, Edwin Sutherland. And basically, it turns on the idea that we're not born knowing how to play bridge or born knowing how to speak Spanish. We've got to learn it, right? It's not a biological function. We've got to learn how to do things. And so these people say, well, how do you learn to be a criminal? And what does it mean to learn to be a criminal? And they say, well, you need 2 things to be a criminal. 1, you need the right attitude, right? You need an attitude that says it's okay to do this. You need a rationale, an ideology that says it's okay to perhaps kill other people or break the law in some way. And then also you may need to know some technology. If you're going to be a suicide bomber, you're going to need to know how to make a suicide vest or know someone who has one. So there's what do you learn when you learn to be a criminal? You learn some methodology, some technology, but you also learn that it's okay to do it. And learning theory says that this tends to happen in groups because we are group animals. We learn from the people around us. We're most influenced by people we trust, we have an emotional connection to, and so on. So there's an idea that exposure to radical beliefs in small groups might be the primary drivers of criminal behavior. So from that we took 2 hypotheses. 1, compared to other political extremists, those with radical family members are more likely to participate in violence. So if you happen to be born, into Osama bin Laden's family, maybe you're more likely to engage in terrorism yourself. And 2, compared to other extremists who have radical peers are more likely to participate in violence. So a number of terrorism researchers like Mark Sageman has pointed out that a lot of terrorism is like a bunch of guys, right? In other words, it's kind of like gangs in the sense that you have perhaps people you're playing soccer with or people you're drinking beer with. There's small groups that get together and start hatching these ideas. So we were interested in this possibility as well. We have a variety of other criminology-related hypotheses. There's a lot of research in criminology suggesting that serious mental illness may give you a propensity to get involved in crime. So we said, well, does this apply also to violent extremism? So do individuals with a history of mental illness, are they more likely to turn to violent extremism? And I know we've got a number of people dealing with gangs in here, so you know there's a large gang literature about turf rivalries and turf battles and so on, with some expectation that gangs get more dangerous when they've got competition in the neighborhood. At least there's more violence between them, there's more friction and so on. And there's something parallel to that in the terrorism literature. It's called outbidding, and maybe some of you have run into this term. The idea is when you've got terrorist groups that are competing, they might up their game to sort of look more alluring to recruits and to have more street cred. So in other words, there are people who argue that terrorism is more dangerous when there are competing gangs. So we thought about this as well. So we argued that perhaps compared to other extremists, those who are engaged in competition with rival groups or fellow group members are going to be more violent, more likely to participate in violence. And then there's several almost throwaway criminology ideas that all of you are very familiar with. One is that individuals with a prior record are more likely to commit future violence. I mean, this is baked into almost all of our procedures for parole and probation and sentencing and so on. And the criminal record, unfortunately, is a pretty strong indicator of future behavior. And gender also, of course, one of the best predictors you can make in criminology. If you know nothing else about violent crime, you're guessing it's a man. And likewise, you're guessing it's a young man. So we also said, well, do these predictors also work when it comes to a large sample of violent political extremists? So as I say, the sample is this PIRUS database, 1,493 individuals, 3 ideological groups, based on court documents and open sources. And just to be clear on this, what we're looking at, the predictor, or the variable we're trying to predict is violence, violent behavior. And we use the UCR pretty much for violent behavior. So the main type 1 offenses from the UCR: murder, assault, armed robbery, kidnapping. Nonviolent behavior, common nonviolent behavior in the database includes money laundering, providing weapons to an extremist group, illegal weapons possession, and tax fraud. I think one of the things we miss, again, when we think about terrorism, is we often think about the suicide bomber or the person who's actually doing the attacks. But there's often an organization that needs drivers and cooks and support staff, basically. They're also a part of the show. And we don't actually know that much about, do you start out as is it the case that you can start out as a cook and end up as a bomber? I mean, is there movement between those different categories and so on? And we're trying to look at some of those issues as well. So that's the dependent variable that we're looking at. And social control, we're looking at the variables I mentioned here: work history, educational attainment, and so on, social learning, mental illness, etc. So we also wanted to control, we weren't that interested in ideology for this particular project, but we thought we had to control for it because there are some important differences in ideology. So we have variables that control for far left, far right, jihadist, and single issue. We also control for the possibility that things are changing over time, so we include variables that look at when the case originated. And we've got an analytical strategy. I'm going to start out by looking at a bivariate analysis, and then we'll get into a multivariate analysis. I'm not going to bore you with the details so much, but although I'd be happy to drill into this if you like. There's missing data. When you're dealing with open sources, you run into this problem, like if the source doesn't mention that the person was mentally ill, does that mean it didn't happen? I mean, you end up it's not like an interview where you ask a person about their mental health. We're looking at records to talk about it. And you would think that, it's not equally likely that people will mention something that didn't happen, right? So we have a fair amount of missing data in the analysis. Okay, so I thought I would ask this group, because this isn't a typical group, but we've got a lot more combined expertise than I often in the audiences I typically address. So here's a list of about 11 things that could be related to violent political extremism for this large sample of Americans. And by the way, this sample, it's not all of the cases we could find over this period, but it's about 60%. It's a random sample that's about 60%. So this is by far the largest sample of terrorism cases I think anybody's ever put together for the United States. So it's a pretty large database, at least in terms of the United States. So I thought I'd just go through. So think about which of these do you think is going to be related, and then I'll show you what we actually found. So maybe we can do just a show of hands. How many of you think stable employment makes a difference in terms of whether people are going to be violent extremists or not? Anybody? Okay, a few. How about education? Is education going to matter? Okay, again, a few. How about marital status? Marital status? Let's see your hands. Marital status? You don't believe that a woman's going to turn your life around, huh? Most of you. Okay, what about military service? Are people who've had military service less likely to commit violent extremism in the database? How many of you think so? Nope. Okay, how about having radical peers? Yeah, I've got a sophisticated group. You're seeing into the future, I can tell you. Yeah, that's going to end up being important. How about radical family members? Okay, say that as well. Mental illness. Okay. Yeah, that's actually a lot of variation in the group, so not nearly as many as the peers and family members. How about rival groups? When there's rivalries, are they going to be more violent? Okay, a few of you. About like the mental illness group. How about prior criminal record? Yeah, pretty high on that. Gender? Yeah, okay. Age? Okay. All right, well, here's what we found. In terms of the social control variables, and this is just bivariate, so you all know what that means. It's just looking at one variable and comparing it to whether they engage in violence or not. I'll get to the multivariate stuff next. In terms of social control variables, we found strong support for stable employment. Those with stable employment were significantly less likely to engage in violence. And this is kind of interesting because probably 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of people, particularly in the United Nations and other places, were saying terrorism is a poverty problem. And then there was a whole bunch of literature that suggested not really. Like terrorists are not, if you look at the 9/11 crowd, for example, they weren't the poorest of the poor. A lot of them were engineers, a lot of them had degrees, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're finding with stable employment, though, is it's not the poorest of the poor, it's a person that's kind of underachieving. It's a person that should be doing better in their job than they are. Maybe a person who lost their job, or maybe a person who's underemployed. Not necessarily super poor, but not doing as well as they should be for where they're at in their education and life. Education is also a significant predictor. The more highly educated, the less likely to engage in violence. And married is significant. If you're married, less likely to engage in violence. Notice that past military, not significant. Having a past military record does not insulate you from violent extremism. And active military actually works in the opposite direction. That the violent political extremists in the data it's not a hugely significant, but it is significant in the opposite direction. They were more likely to engage in violent political extremism in the database. So it goes opposite of what the social control folks would argue. What about the social learning? Well, both of them are positive and significant. Having radical family members is significantly related to engage in violence, and having radical peers is very significantly related to engaging in extremist violence. Now some of the other individual variables. History of mental illness, very significantly associated with engaging in violent extremism. Rival groups does not have an impact. Not significant. We tried this in a variety of ways. It does not seem to be an impact, at least for the United States. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. So this outbidding thing, which has been done a lot in the Middle East and in other countries to explain, for example, what's been going on in Palestine, does not seem to be picked up here. Some of the other variables, though, all of these demographic variables are pretty good predictors. So criminal record, highly significant. Those with a criminal record more likely to engage in violent extremism. Men are coded 1 and women 0 here. Men are significantly more likely. And age, as you age, you're less likely. Age squared means essentially, it's what we would call a log relationship. As you get older and older, you become less and less likely. So it does tend to be concentrated among young people. So all of those turn out to be significant. So I'm trying to think, I think the group did pretty well. You picked up the peers. You missed the marriage, well, not too many voted for marriage, and a few voted for rival groups, but it wasn't too bad. In terms of the control variables, the far left are much less violent, basically. They're the group that is different from the others. And you think about it, you've got far left involved a bunch of the groups in the 70s. It also involves groups like ELF and ALF, which have had very few, if any, casualties associated with them. In terms of decades of violence, the 1990s were significantly less violent, and the 2010s are significantly more violent. So there is a little bit of difference across the decades as well. Okay, so to summarize all this, these are the supported and the rejected from the list. Shoot, I just realized you all had this in front of you. You could have had a cheat sheet already. So that probably wasn't fair. But anyway, basically all of these, at the bivariate level, all of them were supported except the military service and the rival groups. But this is bivariate, so this is not as strong, right? It's a correlation rather than a causal situation. So, so far what we know is suspects that you're less likely to find violent political extremism when you've got suspects with a stable employment history, more highly educated, married, and older. And you're more likely to find violent political extremism when a suspect is active military, has radical peers, radical family members, prior criminal record, and the suspect is a man. So those are bivariate, though. So we weren't controlling for the other variables. We weren't looking at the relative impact of all of the different variables in the same model. So next we were interested in what happens when you do a multivariate analysis where you put all of these variables in at the same time. When we did this, we found 4 significant predictors of engaging in violent political extremism in the United States. The ones that stayed in when you were controlling for all of the other stuff were unstable employment history, radical peers, a record of mental illness, and a criminal record. So, in terms of social control variables, it looks like stable employment matters. Individuals who have a stable work history are less likely to engage in violent attacks, which generally supports a common criminology argument that employment is a positive social bonding mechanism, that when we like our jobs, when we're good at our jobs, when we're engaged in our jobs, we're less likely to get into criminal behavior. But it does seem to be at odds with a lot of work showing that that socioeconomic status doesn't matter all that much. I think that the explanation is because a lot of this other work has looked at sort of the poorest of the poor as opposed to individuals who are somewhat better off but are underperforming in their jobs. Education, marital status, and military service, they were significant at the bivariate level but not at the multivariate level. So there's some indication that they're important, but not enough to justify it when you get at the multivariate level. In terms of social learning, close relationships do seem to play an important role in decision to commit extremist violence. Individuals who are embedded in tight insular groups, I think this is one of the best predictors in this data, that these individuals are not acting alone. And this is interesting, in fact, because we saw at the beginning this lone wolf scenario where you're getting more and more people involved in so-called lone offender attacks, but it's often more complicated than that. I don't know if you've seen recently, there's a new documentary on Oklahoma City, the Timothy McVeigh case. Did you see it? Did you like it? Yeah, I thought it was too. I highly recommend it. I think it's on Netflix now, in fact. Why did you find it interesting?
In terms of the lone wolf, I thought it was very interesting that the ad sort of mentioned that you can't really claim that he's done this singularly.
Right.
Affiliated with so many different groups and different organizations that helped kind of radicalize him into his mentality and brought him in.
Yes.
It wasn't that he was representing the group, but he was sort of tangentially associated.
Yeah. I had the exact same reaction, that it really showed you that it was, even though he had some help with these 2 other maybe 3 other, but generally it was more complicated than a lone wolf, even though we would have characterized him as a lone wolf in the sense that he wasn't financed by a terrorist organization, worked pretty much alone, and yet it shows how complicated it is. And this seems to come out with this very important role played by peers in here, that having these folks, even if they're categorized as lone wolves, still are part of networks with supporting ideologies, and that seems to be very important, which I think is the next comment. Now it's interesting that radical family members, it was significant in the bivariate. There's a close, it almost was significant in the multivariate. Why do you suppose radical family doesn't matter as much as peers? Yeah.
Family's where you're going to learn the value. That's where they're going to basically understand the ideology. However, with peers, they're going to be more willing to act because they want to kind of show off to the people. They want to kind of come together to perpetrate the acts versus at family. It's just the support of the ideology.
Yeah.
Same in the game.
Yeah. We also thought that, you choose your friends but not your family, right? So we figured that perhaps part of what's going on is that it may be more important for peers and family members because you don't choose them, basically. And it is, like I say, it's close, but it's not as important as peers. Peers really comes out as one of the key ingredients in the equation. So in terms of psychological variables, we have this mental illness variable. It was consistently associated with engaging in extremist violence. But it's open source data. This was not like a psychiatrist report on this individual. So it's pretty crude. All we have is reports of mental health problems, basically. They can be self-reports or somebody else reporting them. So it's difficult to know exactly what the mechanism is. It would be fascinating to be able to drill down with this. So for example, it might be a pull factor where mental illness makes an individual more susceptible to these ideological arguments, more susceptible to being recruited. It also could perhaps be a push factor. In other words, the person is feeling excluded because they've got mental health problems, and therefore they're perhaps driven out of more legitimate groups into other groups. We also don't know I guess I don't have it on here. We also don't have connections between mental illness and other things. Like, we have information on drug and alcohol abuse as well, so we can look a little bit at that, but we don't know the specific details. Like, this is not, as I say, it's not like having a psychiatric report on these individuals. So it would be nice to be able to drill down and have a series of psychiatric reports. But it does look like there's something here. And I mention this because I think a lot of researchers in terrorism studies have not thought they've talked about how terrorist perpetrators test normally. This I think is not a common finding in the terrorism research literature right now. A lot of people have argued, like you look at the 9/11 crew again, there's been arguments saying that they really were not, they weren't psychopaths, they didn't have particular mental health problems. But that is not what we're finding with this sample of individuals. We are finding that they have had considerable mental health issues. I mentioned the gang variables, the rival groups, and the outbidding did not work. Offenders who were members of groups that were in competition with like-minded organizations or had internal strife were no more likely to engage in acts of violence than others. We were surprised by this, frankly. I think, like some of you, we expected this to be significant, in part because there's a lot of terrorism research suggesting that it's important. It could be that outbidding, this process of rivalry, is more important outside of the United States. It may be more important in a place like the Middle East. Maybe it's more important where competition over scarce resources is more intense. We just don't know, but we did not find it in this study. In terms of criminal record, we found consistent evidence that criminal activity prior to radicalization is associated with violent political activity. And it's interesting that the violent, it worked no matter what that criminal record was. It wasn't just violent priors. It was any criminal activity. It worked pretty much the same. So we included nonviolent crimes like drug offenses and larceny. Any kind of criminal activity seemed to increase your chances of engaging in violent political extremism. which, supports a lot of classic literature in criminology. And as I say, it's baked into most of the tests we use in courts and probation and parole and sentencing. Usually, prior criminal record is one of the key things we look at. Gender and age were very significant in the bivariate analysis, but they weren't significant in the multivariate. And I think the explanation for gender is simply there were so few women in the sample. 90% of our sample was men, so the chances of that being significant in that kind of skewed lopsided distribution. So it's clearly there at the bivariate level. And I think age is interesting because it is a part of the picture, but it's not as important a part of the picture as it is in ordinary crime. So in other words, as we were talking about a moment ago, offenders that have committed violent political terrorist acts tend to be older. By as much as 7 or 8 years, basically, even though they're engaged in about the same amount of time in the terrorist organization. So, what happens when you put all this together? So we got these 4 risk factors that were the strongest in the multivariate models. And I want to talk a little bit about interpreting this. So we found that if you have one of these risk factors, your chances of engaging in violent political extremism are just under 60%. If you have 2, it goes up to 67%. If you have 3, it's about 85%. If you have all 4, 100%. So everybody in the sample with all 4 of those characteristics engaged in violent political extremism. So as law enforcement, I certainly want to know this, but it's also important to note another aspect of these findings, which is people who had none of these characteristics, 41% of them were still likely to engage in violent political extremism, right? So you can interpret this table in 2 very different ways. One way is, pretty important differences when you've got these characteristics, but this is not the whole story. This is what I was saying before. I mean, I think this is an important part of the story. We need to get much better at it, but there's still a huge chunk missing because you've got, people with none of these characteristics also engaging in violent political extremism. So we'd like to try to push the data as far as we can, and it remains to be seen how far you can push open source unclassified data, but we'll push it as far as we can. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, I think by placing a greater emphasis on indicators like this, we can perhaps help law enforcement get a better idea of the sorts of things that they should be looking at. These are statistics, right? You will find, not every case is going to fit. There will be exceptions, and you obviously have to be alert to that. On the other hand, I think it's a useful tool to know the sorts of things that are most likely to be important. Efforts should also be made to incorporate the effects of variables that are present in childhood. I mean, we could perhaps do some sorts of things that would deter things like we're being concerned about early history of mental illness, for example, employment records, and so on. And I think in general that criminology, as I say, has been late to this party. They're getting engaged now. In fact, the American Society of Criminology now has a terrorism research division that has several hundred members. There is now, I think we're training a new generation of researchers that are going to be looking at things like terrorism and political violence much more than in the past, but we've been a bit slow to get to it. In terms of policy implications, I think there's some idea in these data that providing job-relevant skills could be effective for at-risk individuals. I think with regard to countering violent extremism programs, it suggests that we shouldn't get too far into this lone actor phenomenon, that it looks like it still matters even for lone actors to have a radical peer network. It also tells us that, we have a lot of programs based on providing counter-narratives to individuals that are radicalizing. I'm going to, in fact, I'll pass out cards in just a second that provide this training module that we do for FEMA that involves some of these techniques. And I think what you got to be aware of is it's hard to have a successful counter-narrative, one that really works, when you're aiming it at a small group of tight-knit individuals, mostly men. It's going to be a pretty powerful argument against believing a counter-narrative. And I think we can do a lot more to untangle the relationship between mental illness and violent extremism, including compounding factors. Like we have some measures of drug use, but they're pretty primitive. It'd be nice to have much more detailed measures. And I guess finally, CVE policy should leverage existing programs that are steered towards keeping kids out of crime to begin with, because that also is a predictor for violent political extremism. So I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Dr. LaFree, thank you.
Yep.